Today's topic of discussion is impact weighing. Now let's begin with a brief review of the word impact. What is an impact? Well, impacts generally only appear in a policy debate. The reason being that in a policy round, the debate becomes about whether or not we should implement a plan. Thus, it boils down to whether or not the plan has more positive or more negative impacts. An impact answers the question, how does that affect the world? So, in a policy debate, we generally see a lot of claims thrown at the judge. For example, the plan will increase tensions between the US and Russia. The impacts are there to tell us why these claims are significant, why we care if they're true. So let's say that the claim is the plan will increase emissions. Well, we can impact that out to climate change, which then extends to poverty, resource wars, the extinction, etc. What is an impact? Well, an impact appears in Toulmin's model, claim, data, impact. Toulmin's model in a policy round applies to harms, advantages, and disadvantages. The claim is the argument. The data is the evidence, reasoning, or logic to support the argument. Finally, we end with the impact, or why we care. How does that affect the world? Here are some common impacts that you'll see in round. Now, the ones that I already touched on are climate change, the extinction, poverty, etc. However, there are many others, such as COVID-19, food scarcity, and nuclear war. Some more probable than others, some more significant than others. Note that impacts are clearly not one-dimensional. Instead, are complex concepts that feed into each other. For example, bee extinction is just a subset of climate change. Poverty feeds into COVID-19, economic recession, nuclear war, climate change, etc. Now let's discuss a slightly more complex idea, impact calculus. Impact calculus is a type of argumentation that compares the impacts of arguments on the on case, or the government team's case, and the off case, or the opposition team's case. The goal is to ultimately demonstrate that the impacts on your side are greater than the impacts on your opponent's side. The idea is that even if all of the arguments on your opponent's side are true, it doesn't matter and you should still win the round because your arguments are more significant, are more impactful, if you will, than your opponent's. Why? Because it's a clear-cut reason for the judge to vote for you. Now, impact calculus generally comes out in the two rebuttal speeches. We'll remember that the first four speeches of the round are constructive, while the last two are rebuttal. Because in a rebuttal speech you are not allowed to introduce new information, impact calculus is a common strategy that debaters use to prove that the judge should vote for you without introducing anything new. There are four different ways that you can weigh impacts: magnitude, probability, time frame, and reversibility. Let's begin with magnitude, or the significance of the impact. My impact outweighs my opponent's impact off magnitude because my impact is more significant. The second is probability, or the likelihood that the impact will occur. One could argue that my impact is more important than my opponent's impact on probability because mine is more likely or more probable. The third is time frame, or the time in which the impacts operate. My impact outweighs my opponent's impact on time frame because it will happen sooner. Finally, reversibility, or the possibility for the impact to be undone. My impact outweighs my opponent's impact on reversibility because my impacts are irreversible, whereas my opponent's are reversible. Let's begin with magnitude, or how significant the impact is. Two common impacts that are usually compared are climate change and economic recession. One could argue that climate change outweighs economic recession on magnitude because it has the potential to harm more people. Now, let's say that there's an argument on the government team's case that states that 10,000 people will be harmed. On the other hand, the opposition team has an argument that says that 20,000 people will be harmed. In this case, the impacts on the off case outweigh the impacts on the on case on magnitude because the off case has the potential to harm more people. Next, there's probability, or the likelihood that the impact will occur. Returning back to the climate change example, one could inversely argue that an economic recession outweighs climate change on probability because it is more likely to occur, making it much more pressing. The argument here is essentially that magnitude is insignificant compared to probability, because no matter how significant an impact is, it doesn't matter if it never occurs. Thirdly, we have time frame, or how soon the impact will occur. Now, returning back to the climate change example, one could argue that an economic recession outweighs climate change on time frame because it will happen first. Now, you may be wondering, okay, but why do I care if an impact happens first? Well, let's go back to the economic recession idea. Well, if an economic recession occurs, two things will happen. One, we'll lack the resources to actually address climate change when it inevitably occurs. The second thing that will happen is that we'll actually see the rates of poverty increase, which will actually increase the rate of climate change. Simply because, let's take Brazil as an example. In Brazil, farmers, as they become poorer, tend to burn down more of the Amazon rainforest out of desperation. Thus, we can say that if an economic recession happens first, before climate change, it's actually going to be both worse for both impacts. Thus, time frame can actually be a very powerful weapon if wielded correctly. Finally, we have reversibility. Now, one could argue that climate change outweighs an economic recession on reversibility because it simply cannot be undone. Past the point of no return, that's it, you're done. Whereas an economic recession can be returned from. For instance, the Great Depression in the United States has since been overcome. Now, I just went over one way that you can weigh impacts. You weigh one impact directly versus another on magnitude, probability, time frame, or reversibility. This is a very one-dimensional way to weigh impacts. There's actually another way, and it's slightly more meta. Instead, we compare the way to weigh impacts themselves. So let's go back to the climate change versus economic recession idea. Now, one could argue on the government team side that climate change outweighs economic recession on magnitude. However, on the opposition side, you could argue that economic recession outweighs climate change on probability. Thus, we've reached a stalemate. That's why at that point, it can be useful to compare magnitude and probability specifically. Now, on the opposition side, for example, you could argue that probability outweighs magnitude by saying that, for instance, say you're out of milk, and you need to go buy it at a store. Most people would hop into their cars and drive to the store, in doing so risking their lives because of the potential for a car crash. Despite the fact that the magnitude of a car crash is very high, probability outweighs magnitude simply because it is not worth it to walk 10 miles to the store when you can just hop in your car and be there in 2 minutes. Thus, as probability outweighs magnitude, economic recession outweighs climate change. Here's an example. Say the resolution is the USFG should implement a carbon tax. In this case, the government team is advocating for climate change, whereas the opposition team says that the economic impacts are more significant. Gov argues that climate change outweighs on magnitude since it has the ability to wipe out humanity, whereas the opposition argues that economic impacts are much more probable due to a direct result of rising energy costs. And so in this case, once again, we see a stalemate. That's why it can be useful to compare magnitude and probability. In this case, government has to somehow prove that magnitude outweighs probability, and the opposition team has the opposite burden. Okay, so here's a really brief review. You can weigh two impacts on magnitude, probability, time frame, or reversibility. Here's the final factor to consider: consequentialism versus non-consequentialism. Let's begin with consequentialism, which is the direct utilitarian consequences of an impact. Consequentialism is logical, statistical. It appeals to logos. If we do not do something, more people will be harmed, for example. That's a very consequentialist argument. Now, the inverse is non-consequentialism, which discusses the moral implications of an impact. For example, the argument that we have the moral obligation to intervene when we see harm. Now, the strongest impacts have both. They both appeal to logos and to pathos. Now, one way to differentiate between consequentialism and non-consequentialism is the famous trolley problem. Now, you've probably heard of the trolley problem before. It essentially proposes that there is a trolley, and this runaway trolley has two options. One, the way it is right now is that it's going to come kill 5 individual people who are tied to the tracks. However, you find yourself next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch tracks at this fork and instead kill this one innocent bystander. Consequentialism states that you have no choice but to pull this lever and switch the tracks, because then the trolley will only kill one person as opposed to 5, saving a net of 4 lives. The inverse is that non-consequentialism proposes that you have no choice but to allow this trolley to kill 5 people instead of 1, because as a moral individual, you cannot harm one unrelated bystander who otherwise would leave unharmed. Now, I'll note that the trolley problem was initially designed to discuss moral inconsistencies, not the difference between consequentialism and non-consequentialism, but the fundamental basic ideas still stand. And in the end, please just remember that impact weighing is one of the best ways to win the round.